want to talk to my panel now. Michael Crick is here, the broadcaster, author and political guru, and Charles Amos, who's a political commentator. Great to see you both in the studio. Michael, I wonder what you think about Keir Starmer saying things will get worse before they get better. Is this a deliberate political strategy, do you think?
Well, it's to soften everybody up, isn't it, for what's the horrors that are going to be unleashed this autumn by Rachel Reeves and him. You know, the country's finances are in a pretty dire state, and Labour is going to have to introduce some new taxes and make some cuts. Although the scope for cuts is a lot less than it was when George Osborne tried the same exercise 14 years ago. And if he's going to do horrible things, then the beginning of a parliament just after an election is always the best time to do it rather than later, although I suspect he may end up having to do horrible things later as well.
And blaming the previous government, it's a tactic the Conservatives did, Charles. Presumably Labour will just continue to do this as well.
Yes, and I think they're right to blame the previous government. If you look at the budget deficit, it's £122 billion, and the interest on the national debt is £43 billion or £46 billion. So the Conservatives are to blame for that. Even before the COVID spending, the deficit was rising under Boris Johnson, was at about £50 billion. He had undone the efforts that George Osborne and David Cameron had put in place in the previous 9 years. So I think they are right to blame the previous government, and I look forward to the spending cuts that they're going to announce in October. The tax rises, I'm not so fond of.
Michael, tell me about your thoughts on the societal black hole that Keir Starmer is going to be talking about on Tuesday. He's talking about the riots, he's talking about what he thinks caused them, and the fact that he's saying that in the past 14 years it's not just about money.
Well, I mean, the societal, we could go on all day about that, and I think that's something that has crept up on us over many decades. The fact that there is a large chunk of society that feels unused, feels they have little purpose in life, who can't get meaningful employment, can't get employment in many cases, broadly, just, the have-nots. And these are the people, many of them are the people who voted for Brexit and who voted for Boris Johnson and vote for reform. And the middle-class metropolitan elite, of which I'm one, too many of us have ignored those people because we don't come across them that often. They're people who didn't go to university, who live in places with, like Barrow-in-Furness and Hartlepool, but even, places in Kent as well. And we have... We've not brought them to mind enough. We've not thought about what we are doing in society. We've not been inclusive enough in the way in which society has progressed, and in ensuring that what wealth is created is shared more evenly and more equally.
Charles, I wonder what you make of the Conservatives' reaction to this. This is Richard Fuller, who's the chairman of the Conservative Party. I can honestly say I had never heard of Richard Fuller before he became chairman of the Conservative Party. Just 2 months in, and Keir Starmer has taken winter fuel payments of 10 million pensioners, showered billions of taxpayers' money, the Conservatives say, on his union paymasters, and is now engulfed in a cronyism scandal after parachuting donors and supporters into top taxpayer-funded jobs. The soft-touch Labour Chancellor is squandering money whilst fabricating a financial black hole in an attempt to con the public into accepting tax rises and literally leaving pensioners out in the cold. What do you make of that?
I think it's a great shame that the party of sound public finances is attacking the Labour Party for making the tough decisions over winter fuel allowance and other things to bring down the deficit. It's not the right thing to do. It's very, very clearly attempting to score cheap points over the Labour Party, as opposed to putting forward the national interest, which is what a proper party would be doing. They should be backing the measures that Labour is making that are tough.
You believe the tough measures, as you call them, and getting rid of winter fuel allowance for 10 million pensioners is the right thing to do?
Absolutely. It's
Why?
The best thing they have done, because people do not need this money. They're not entitled to this money.
I'll tell you something, there are plenty of pensioners who've contacted me who do need the money.
Yeah, well, I don't believe them.
You don't believe them?
I don't believe them. So if you look at the bottom quintile of pensioners, they spend 17.8% of their income on hotels, restaurants, cigarettes and alcohol. That's the equivalent of £2,100 for them. If you take away the £200 winter fuel allowance from those people, they would only have to cut that expenditure, which could only be described as leisure expenditure, by 10%.
Now, that is
when one of your texters talks about heating or eating, I don't believe he's telling the truth. And for those tiny minority...
There are a number of people who find that an outrageous comment.
Fine.
Michael?
Well, it's an out-of-touch, ivory tower, boffins response, if you don't mind me saying so, Charles. I mean, just to say, oh, well, pensioners have got lots of leisure interests, they go on holiday, they drink alcohol and so on. That may be true in some cases, but there are many pensioners who are so poor they can only heat one room. They have to cut back, and they frequently really live in fear of going into debt, because, of course, if you're retired, it's the prospects of you paying off debt is much harder. And so there really is a genuine hardship. And we're not just talking about the group of people for whom the winter fuel payments will carry on. So I think a little bit more sympathy on your part.
But I'm talking about the bottom 20% of pensioners. And it should be remembered that the very, very, very poorest pensioners, the 1 million pensioners who still receive pension credit, will carry on receiving the winter fuel allowance.
But essentially you're saying, but Charles, you're saying to pensioners who enjoy a fag or a drink, give that up. But if you can't afford things, I mean, are you honestly saying people should stop smoking?
Yes.
I think everybody should. So they should give up any luxury they have. Anything,
no,
a cigarette that gets them through the day.
I'm saying that they should reduce their leisure expenditure by 10%. In fact, less than 10%. Reduce it down from £2,100 to £1,900. That's not much to ask. People are not entitled to force other people to give up the fruits of their labour so they can go on holiday or they can have a pint of beer down the pub. People should stand on their own 2 feet, and this is part of making people stand on their own 2 feet. Ideally, we shouldn't even have a state pension system. Everybody should have a private pension.
Sorry, you shouldn't have a state pension system?
No, not
really?
at all. People should support themselves on their own 2 feet with a private pension.
What about disabled people? Should they just fend for themselves?
Ideally, charities should support those people, or they...
Are you saying, sorry, Charles, are you saying there shouldn't be state benefits for people who are disabled?
Yes.
Why? What is your possible logic for that? People who can't quite literally stand on their own 2 feet. People who, through no fault of their own, are in a situation where they need a handout from the state to survive.
People are entitled to their private property, to the fruits of their labour, and it is wrong for the state to forcefully take that private property from them. Just as we do not accept that charities such as Oxfam can thieve from individuals to support starving Africans in that continent, neither should we accept that private individuals should have their private property stolen from them by the state to support people such as disabled people in their lives.
I'm sure there'll be hardly anybody in this country who takes your view that the society taxing us in order to help those people who are worse off, who are disabled, or maybe who are elderly, who can't work. I think there is a consensus in society that that's how we do operate, and we should operate. And the argument is really about, at the margins, do we do it more, do we do it less? But to have a sort of free-for-all for society where people who are disabled, who are elderly and so on, basically have to go to the wall unless they're lucky enough to have a charity that comes along and helps them. That is not our world. In fact, it's not anybody's world on this planet, as far as I know. There is a natural human tendency for people to be generous, to think I can give up some of my income, I can give up a large amount of my income, and they do it through the state because that's a more efficient way of doing it.
We need to go to a break, but I want to get a word from Charles just before the break. Go ahead.
If people want to do that, they can give to charity, but it is wrong to threaten people with prison if they don't give up their income to those individuals. A free society is one where we respect people's private property. The state doesn't do that.
I quite like a society where we respect people who can't look after themselves. Let us know what you think about what Charles is saying and what Michael's saying and what I'm saying. 0344 499 1000. Stay with us here on Talk. Axe. She's under fire after stating up to 10 million people will lose the benefits. Charles is here, Charles Amos. He was talking about how charities should step in, but if they're overwhelmed, how can they step in, Charles?
Well, they wouldn't step in if they were overwhelmed, and those people would suffer as a result.
OK. Michael, just a final thought on this particular story?
Well, I think the Labour government is going to have to modify its proposals. I think the clamour from within the party and from the country as a whole, I think there's going to have to be, and you know, from what's his name, the consumer, I've forgotten his name,
Richard Fuller.
No, not Richard Fuller. But the clamour here is so great that I think they will have to modify their plans and widen the beneficiaries.
And it's gone on for some time as well. Yeah.
Martin Lewis is who I was thinking of. Yeah.
Martin Lewis, yes, the money-saving expert. I never make a financial decision without consulting his website, it must be said. Right then, I want to talk about employees, which a union says, the Bakers, Food and Allied Workers Union, says that all employees should have the right to stop working under a national maximum temperature for workplaces. This would be 27 degrees for strenuous work or 30 degrees for sedentary work. It wants a heat wave furlough scheme where workers are guaranteed they're paid the same if production has to stop because of excessive temperatures. It's got 60,000 members. It said the employers themselves who fund wages for these periods where work is not taking place owing to the heat. So, I mean, you've got bakers complaining about high temperatures, Michael. A lot of people will raise an eyebrow at this one.
Yeah, I mean, 27 degrees, 30 degrees, well, it's out. It's often that outside these days.
Yeah, 35.
I'm surprised there aren't rules already for maximum temperatures for employers. I mean, clearly there are levels of temperature which would be excessive. And that it would be reasonable for people to stop working. I mean, Charles is a sort of, you know, seems to disagree with that. But I mean, you know, 100 degrees centigrade, you'd be happy for people to work in those circumstances. You know, look, unions make demands. Employers rebuff them. They reach a settlement. This is only a demand.
Well, but the unions are in the ascendancy in this country. We've got the...
No, they're not. The unions are weaker now than they've been for a very long time.
Well, you're the expert. You know about you, but certainly they're certainly getting action and they're getting acquiescence.
Well,
so the train drivers,
what's happening with the train drivers and the junior doctors is, and I'm sure Charles will approve of this, this is free market, and indeed you, this is free market forces at work. There is a shortage of junior doctors. There's going to be there's a shortage of train drivers, and large numbers of train drivers are due to leave the industry in the next few years. So what do you do about replenishing the numbers of train drivers if you want the railways to carry on working, you want the hospitals to carry on working?
Yeah.
You put up their wages. If you can think of another way of increasing the number of train drivers or the number of doctors, I think let's hear it.
I think Charles might just, speaking of heat, I think Charles might be about to spontaneously combust. Well, go ahead, Charles.
The great virtue of the state employing nurses and doctors and train drivers is that they're pretty much the sole purchaser. It's not a competitive market. It's not a competitive market at all. And this gives the state a lot of power. It's a monopoly buyer of that labour. So if I was in charge of the state, I would use that monopoly power to suppress the wages of doctors and nurses and train drivers to try and get the best value possible for taxpayers. I certainly would not be increasing train drivers' wages by 11%.
Well,
not at all.
So what would you do then if doctors and train drivers say, right, well, I shall give up being a train driver, I'll go and be a baker or something? Or if doctors say, well, it's not really worth being a doctor, the number of hours...
I'm off to Australia.
I'm off to Australia or New Zealand or Ireland. What are you going to do then?
Well, in case of the doctors, then it might be necessary to increase their wages. Yeah. It may be necessary there. But when it comes to train drivers, I'd say, fine, go. We'll put the army in the place whilst you're not there.
Surely the army is already stretched. It's at its lowest level ever, and the army has got other things
and then
to do.
we'll automate the trains.
And the Russians will love that, won't they? There's no British army, they're all driving trains.
Is automated in Paris, so I'd automate the trains. That's how I would...
There are some automated trains in the UK as well, although I did speak to couple of train drivers last week, actually, who said we're so far away from doing it for the ones on the main line, although they do...
because of them. Because of them. Every time automation tries to go ahead, for example, by getting rid of the people that sell the tickets and just having machines do it, they all have a strike, and then the government of the day goes, oh, we can't have these strikes going on, we'll increase your pay and we won't do that.
Well, I don't blame them.
Neither do I. I don't blame them for doing it.
I mean, it's one thing to have an automated train on the Docklands Light Railway where it just trundles along, But when it's a high-speed train travelling from London to Edinburgh at well over 100 miles an hour, then I don't think most of the public would want that to be an automated train.
No,
Furthermore, we can't get rid of all jobs in society. We've got to have something to do. But the crucial point about this is that I travel on the railways all the time. 400 miles yesterday, 100 miles tomorrow, and I'm fed up of my trains being cancelled because there aren't enough train drivers, and this is having a serious effect on the economy. If people can't get to work because of or they get to work late, or they get or because of their train vanishing, then that is really, really damaging. And that's why we have to allow free market forces to play here. And the best way to get more train drivers and more doctors, and indeed maybe some other areas of society. And I'm surprised that the Conservative government, being a free market government, didn't realise this. And now Labour, and thankfully Labour has.
Charles?
If it is genuinely the case that by increasing the pay of train drivers we're going to see increased tax revenue such that that's going to mitigate for their increased cost, then I'm all in favour of it. But I doubt that is the case. If somebody can show me a document to show that is the case, then I'd back the increase for train drivers.
I want to take a call from Ruth in Bedford, who I think has perhaps taken exception to what Charles has said. Ruth, you're very welcome to the programme. You're on with me and with Michael Crick and Charles Amos as well. What would you like to say today?
I'd like to say about the winter allowance that not all pensioners are rolling around the countryside and on planes going abroad and spending money in hotels. I have just the basic pension. I have to pay a bit of my rent because my rent isn't covered fully by the housing benefit. And I am desperate. I'm actually Avril, who you got a text from last week, Peter.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And I am absolutely desperate. I've had a 23% rise in my rent this year. And how this man can sit there and say that most of the pensioners don't need this, I can't understand it, because there's 10 million of us who aren't getting it. And there's an awful lot of people in my situation who have nothing, and we're living on £228 a week. And I challenge him to do that, especially when you've got to pay rent out of it as well. You've got the increase in the in all the bills and everything. Yeah. Everything's just going up, and you can't get pension credit if you get the full pension.
Charles, what would you say to her?
£228 a week.
I would say this. If you look at the bottom 20% of pensioners, they spend 17.8%.
I don't think she cares about statistics. I think she cares about how she lives.
Well,
exactly.
Does the caller live in a flat, or does she live in a room in somebody's house?
It makes absolutely no difference where I live.
Well, it does, because if you live in a flat, you could live in a room in somebody else's house. As I do.
Thank you. At my age.
Why not?
Why
should other people subsidise you to live in a flat through their labour?
Hold on, let her speak.
You listen to me. When you've had a family and lived independently for all those years, why should I go and live in one room with somebody's family just because I haven't got enough to pay my electric bill?
Because it's not right.
Why should I?
I'll tell you why. Because it's not right that other people should be forced to give up their income to subsidise you to live in a flat or an apartment where you don't have to live with other people. It's all very well...
Excuse me, just wait a minute, wait there. Do you have a grandmother?
I do have a grandmother.
Would you put her in a house with somebody else that you don't know, that nobody knows in your family? Would you put her in a one room to share? Tell me that. Would you do that?
I wouldn't want to, and my dad wouldn't allow it to happen because he's wealthy enough.
Yes, OK, because your dad's got money, right?
Yes, because my dad has money. If he has money, he can do more stuff than you, who doesn't have as much money.
Exactly. So why should I be punished?
You're not being punished. If you don't have money, you can't have as much stuff. It's as simple as that. And you shouldn't expect other people to pay taxes to support you to live in the lifestyle that you want.
Charles, let her speak. Let her speak. Go ahead, Ava.
I have worked all my life. I've brought out 5 children, mostly on my own, and they all work. Now, this isn't right that I am not being able to pay my electric bill. It's just not right that I should be put into a room sharing in a house with other people at my age. It isn't fair.
Well, I would disagree entirely. Maybe if you didn't have 5 children and you had fewer children, you could have saved a bit more and you wouldn't end up in that situation.
My 5 children are all looking after everybody else by paying tax because they work hard. One is actually a train driver. So, you know, I just give up.
Charles, I think a lot of people will find what you're saying quite cruel.
Fine. It's true.
Do you not have compassion for people like Ruth?
These people who are moaning about the winter fuel allowance being cut do not need the money. They can cut their leisure expenditure by 10%. And when they pretend that there's a choice between heating and eating, they're making things up.
OK, final word to... sorry, is it Ruth or Avril? What's your name?
Well, I'm Avril.
You're Avril, OK. No, you said it was Ruth. OK, well, your name's... and Avril, you really actually spoke to me last week with that message that you texted in,
yes,
so thank you for it, and thanks for your call as well. So just a final word now to Charles.
My final word to Charles is, I hope when he gets to my age, he is not sitting in a one-bedroom room. OK. Well, listen, thank you, Avril. I really appreciate that. Thanks to Charles as well and Michael Crick. We'll come back to them after the break. Stay with us here on Talk. Well, quite a few people getting in touch about Charles's comments. Chris in Newbury says, Charles Amos has lost all credibility. A pensioner who might have worked all her life should now go to live in a room in a house. What a disgusting little man. Charles, I promised in the break that I would read out some of those, and I also promised I'd let you respond to them. And I know you want to respond to that, but also the point about paying in all your life.
Well, yes, a lot of people say, I've paid in all of my life, so I'm entitled to get that money back out. Interestingly, if you look at how much boomers have paid in, for every £1 they've paid in, they will have taken out £1.20.
How do you get to that figure?
That's from the Resolution Foundation. So that's adding up all of the money they've paid in and subtracting all of the money that they have taken out or will taken out. So when people make that argument, the average person makes that argument, not wealthy pensioners, but when the average person makes that argument, it just doesn't go through because the facts don't back it up. In fact, cutting winter fuel allowance is ensuring that people really do just get out what they've paid in, which is less. So unless they're wealthy pensioners that are texting in, they can't make this argument, I've paid in all of my life, so I'm entitled to get what I've paid in out, because they've already taken more out than they have paid in. And that's especially true of poorer people.
Let's say OK boomer to Michael Craig.
The trouble is your figures are all about the average person. The average person, the average person may have had 3 children at school or 2 children, or they may have used the health service. But we don't know that Avril, who rang in, is an average person. And what your whole attitude is so cold-hearted. And frankly, I think what you said to her about how she'd made things up was offensive. And I think you should be a little bit more moderate and understanding and sympathetic in the way you approach this, because you do have some important points to make, but the way you're making them, I think, is just like a blunderbuss. Now, the problem here is that people, when they were working and when they were younger and fit and able to get jobs and so on, did so on the understanding that when they got older and retired and were less able to work, that the state would look after them and that society as a whole would look after them. And and therefore big changes that occur to people when they're retired, it's much harder for older people to offset those by suddenly going out and getting a job or finding some new form of income. Because once you get older, and particularly if you're very old and disabled and so on, it's very hard to find new sources of income. And it's that sort of social compact that we have that leaves people in a very difficult circumstance here. Now, if we're going to have a free-for-all kind of society where, people who pay hardly any taxes, and if you're all, and you have to look after yourself, and if you don't get a job and you're poor and you die and so on, that's just tough luck. That's not the kind of society I'd want. But if you're going to have a free-for-all society, you need to give people a warning that that's going to happen.
Charles.
Well, let me first apologise to Avril if I've said that she's making things up. I can't comment on her individual case. So if I did say you're making things up to her, let me apologise to her. I can't talk about specific instances because I don't know her background. So I apologise if that's the case. when it comes to people who've paid in all their lives, so they should only get they should get what they've paid in. Let me say this: the winter fuel allowance. When was that introduced? You must know.
Well, it was introduced by wasn't it introduced by Labour in the 70s? It was certainly I think it was, but I don't know. I can't say for sure.
We'll ask our producer Chris just to check when the winter fuel allowance was introduced. Okay.
But the point is, people can adjust to this. The vast majority of people can adjust to this. And I would agree with you in saying that if people have paid in, they should get what they've paid in out. But when it comes to the winter fuel allowance, most people haven't paid in enough to warrant it. And when we're speaking about Avril, who I assume is a poorer individual, I am entitled to say that she isn't entitled to the winter fuel allowance, because if she is below average, and she was suggesting that she was below average, she hasn't paid enough in the first place to warrant getting anything or
you're talking
getting
about
the
people
winter fuel
warranting.
allowance.
By the way, the winter fuel allowance in its current form was introduced in 1997. But I mean, you're saying warranting these things. There are people who are on entitlements and benefits and things like that. The whole language around this. I mean, you said earlier on that you didn't believe that disabled people should get benefits. I mean, at what stage would you give people some help from the state, or would you just not give anybody any help from the state at any stage?
People are entitled to their person and property. If the state has stolen from them, they're entitled to get that money back from the state.
Do you believe tax is theft?
In the form of benefits. Yes, taxation is theft. We should have a free-for-all society.
You could argue
people
that property originally was theft. You know, when people said...
the famous communist Proudhon.
You know, originally people said, right, I'm having this bit of land and building a house, and as a result, they and their successors became very, very wealthy. So to start talking about tax being theft...
Note
when the
implicit...
The social compact we have is that, yeah, we agree to pay taxes, we elect a government, we have a democratic system, we moan about it a bit, and if we don't like our taxes, we elect in a different government. There is an understanding we pay tax. We don't regard taxes as theft.
There is no social contract. I have never signed a social contract which gives the state the right to take my income. And if I don't abide by the state's, if I don't abide by the state's orders, I'm put in prison. The idea that this organisation, the state, is a voluntary organisation is a fiction, and the vast majority of political philosophers agree on this point. And I would note this: when Michael Crick spoke about original acquisition and it being theft, that implies that society has a right to all of the land originally. And what is that? That is a form of communism. Society does not have
Michael Crick is many things, but he's not a communist.
Well, perhaps not a communist, but definitely a socialist, because he is asserting that society...
I don't think he's a socialist either.
He is asserting there that society has a right to all of the land originally.
No, but let him speak. We've only got about a minute left. Let Michael
I was
speak.
using that as an illustration. So you cannot assume that that everybody's property was acquired legitimately. All sorts of property was acquired very illegitimately, maybe not by the people concerned, but by their ancestors, and then they inherited it.
Okay. I mean, we've gone in a number of different directions that I wasn't really expecting to go in this morning. But that's the beauty of having two people such as you on. We go in all sorts of directions on this, and indeed where you want to go as well, because you can give me a ring, you can respond. We're losing Michael and Charles, sadly, but you can continue to respond to their